Los Angeles, January 15th, 1947. The city was still shaking off the fog of war. Soldiers had returned home, the economy was booming, and Hollywood glittered with the promise of fame. Yet just below the surface, Los Angeles was a city divided between glamour and grit, between opportunity and desperation. At 10 a.m. that morning, a young mother strolled down Norton Avenue in the quiet neighborhood of Leimert Park. Her baby shifted in the stroller as she walked, the wheels crunching against the gravel. It was a routine morning, until something in the vacant lot ahead caught her eye. At first glance, it looked like a store mannequin discarded in the dirt. Pale, motionless, split apart, the kind of thing one might ignore if not for its starkness against the earth. She slowed her steps. The closer she came, the more details sharpened. What she had thought was a mannequin was not plastic, not harmless, and not discarded. It was human. She froze. The figure lying in the lot was the body of a young woman. She had been cut cleanly in half at the waist. Her arms stretched above her head, her face turned toward the sky. The skin was ghastly white, drained entirely of blood. Her body had been scrubbed, polished almost, leaving no trace of the violence that had been inflicted upon her, only the result. There was no blood in the soil, no sign of how she had been brought there. No footprints, no tire tracks, only silence. The cuts were not wild or reckless. They were precise, as though performed by someone who knew anatomy, who had studied how flesh could be separated from bone. The torso was cleanly severed at the spine, and both halves positioned just inches apart, arranged as though for display. The body had been staged, and the face mutilated, the lips slashed from ear to ear into a permanent, mocking grin, a smile that had no joy, only cruelty. Police arrived within minutes, but the scene did not stay contained for long. By noon, reporters had swarmed the lot. Neighbors, too, drawn by whispers of a discovery too gruesome to imagine. Camera shutters exploded. Typewriters clattered in nearby offices as words spread like wildfire. A murder like this had never been seen before in Los Angeles. It was brutality and theater. The victim's fingerprints told investigators her name by that very afternoon. Her identity traveled across wires and machines to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, where within minutes, a match was found. She was 22 years old. Her name was Elizabeth Short. Elizabeth was no stranger to Los Angeles. Like so many before her, she had come in search of a dream, drawn by the glow of Hollywood, by the promise of stardom, by the hope of something greater than the life she had known. But now, those dreams were extinguished, and in their place was something else: fear, fascination, and a question that would haunt America for generations. Who killed Elizabeth Short? Why had her body been left in such a state? And what was the message hidden in this act of cruelty? This was not just murder. This was spectacle. It was the kind of crime designed to be remembered, to scar not only a city, but the very imagination of a nation. To the world, she would be remembered by a single name. But before she became the Black Dahlia, she was Elizabeth Short, a daughter, a sister, and a dreamer. She wasn't born into privilege or wealth or fame. She was born into hardship. And like many who came of age in the Depression, she learned early that life could take away as easily as it gave. Elizabeth Short entered the world on July 29, 1924, in Boston, Massachusetts, the third of 5 daughters. Her early years seemed ordinary until one event would change everything. Her father, Cleo Short, supported the family by building miniature golf courses. When the stock market crashed, his business collapsed. And then, one day, his car was found abandoned by a bridge. At first, neighbors whispered he had taken his own life. For years, that was the story Elizabeth and her sisters lived with, that their father was gone and their mother, Phoebe, would raise them alone. But the truth was stranger. Cleo wasn't dead at all. He had simply walked away, abandoning his family in their darkest years. To Elizabeth, barely a child, it was a betrayal that left a wound she would never forget. Her childhood was marked by poverty, by instability, and by the shadow of a father who chose absence over duty. Her mother worked tirelessly to keep the family afloat. Elizabeth grew up in Medford, just north of Boston. She was a bright, spirited girl with striking features, jet black hair, pale skin, and blue-green eyes that caught the attention of anyone who looked too long. She was quiet at times, but carried herself with a presence that set her apart. Those around her often described her as kind, with a certain grace, but also with a longing for something more. Elizabeth wasn't free from struggle. She suffered from asthma and chronic bronchitis as a child. The winters of New England were harsh on her lungs. Doctors advised her to spend warmer months elsewhere, and she often stayed with relatives in Florida. Those journeys south gave her a glimpse of a world beyond her hometown, a world of palm trees, ocean breezes, and a life that seemed brighter than the gray streets of Massachusetts. Like many young women of her time, Elizabeth dreamed of something greater. Hollywood, in the 1940s, was a beacon. It promised stardom, glamour, and the chance to escape the ordinary. The silver screen turned ordinary girls into legends. For Elizabeth, who grew up with so little, the dream of Hollywood was not just ambition, it was hope. By her late teens, Elizabeth began to embrace the style that would define her. Dark, stylish clothing, carefully applied makeup, lips painted in red. She had a knack for presenting herself as though she were already a star. She was known to charm men easily, and she enjoyed the attention. But beneath the surface, she carried uncertainty. She longed for stability, for romance, for a life that made her feel safe. Friends and acquaintances often described her as shy at first, but warm once you knew her. She loved to laugh. She could light up a room, yet her life was never easy. Without steady work, Elizabeth moved often, drifting between friends' apartments, cheap hotel rooms, and short-term arrangements. She did not own a car. She lived on the edges of survival, holding onto the dream of something better. When World War II broke out, the city of Los Angeles changed. Servicemen filled its streets, dance halls, and bars. Hollywood thrived on the energy of returning soldiers and hopeful actresses. But for every star who found success, countless others vanished into the background. It was a city of contrasts, glamour on the surface, desperation beneath it. Crime rates surged. Corruption in the police department was whispered about openly. Nightclubs, brothels, and gambling dens flourished. Los Angeles was beautiful, yes, but dangerous. Elizabeth stepped into this world in 1946. She had already traveled through Florida, Massachusetts, and California before, moving in search of work and companionship. But Los Angeles was different. It was the city of dreams, and she wanted to belong to it. To the men who met her, Elizabeth was unforgettable. Her striking looks, her charm, her soft laugh. She left impressions wherever she went, but she also kept secrets. She never stayed in one place for long. She struggled with money, and she leaned on strangers more often than most. To those who knew her, she seemed both strong and vulnerable. Some said she carried herself with elegance, like a star already on her way to fame. Others noticed her fragility, the way she seemed always one step away from trouble. She was young. She was hopeful. But she was also alone in a city that could devour the unprotected. And this leads us to a question that still echoes today. Did Elizabeth Short's dream of Hollywood place her in danger? Did her search for glamour and stability expose her to those who would take advantage? Or was she simply unlucky, caught at the wrong time, in the wrong place among the wrong people? What do you think? Was Elizabeth Short destined to meet tragedy because of the path she chose, or was she an innocent victim of circumstance, her life stolen not by her choices, but by the cruelty of another? As 1946 gave way to 1947, Elizabeth's life in Los Angeles seemed uncertain. She floated through the city, meeting friends, chasing opportunity, looking for work. She was trying, always trying, to carve a space for herself in a world that demanded beauty but rarely offered kindness. Yet within weeks, her name would no longer belong to the quiet young woman with dark hair and a radiant smile. It would belong to something else. A case, a mystery, a headline, and soon she would be remembered not for her dreams, but for the way those dreams came to an end. Elizabeth Short's final days form a shadowed trail across Southern California. Fragments of sightings, whispered recollections, and blank stretches of time that no one has ever been able to fill. Each hour carried her closer to a moment of unthinkable violence. But at the time, she was just another young woman navigating the chaos of post-war Los Angeles. What follows is not just a timeline. It is the last fragile thread of her life, slowly unraveling. In early January, Elizabeth had found shelter in San Diego. For several weeks, she drifted between cheap hotels and friends' couches until she met Dorothy French, a kind-hearted teenager who worked as an usher at a local movie theater. Dorothy discovered Elizabeth sleeping in one of the theater's seats after the final show, curled up, exhausted, and out of options. When asked, Elizabeth admitted she had nowhere else to go. Dorothy, struck by her charm and vulnerability, invited her home. For several days, the French family cared for her. Elizabeth slept on their couch, shared meals at their table, and spoke with Dorothy about movies, actors, and the future. To the Frenches, she seemed both glamorous and fragile. A young woman who wanted more from life, but carried with her the weight of struggle. Neighbors remembered her as polite, even radiant, but with an air of sadness that was difficult to miss. Yet Elizabeth could not stay. She was restless, and Los Angeles, with its promise of opportunity and danger, was calling her back. On January 8th, she announced she was leaving for the city once again. How she traveled is still debated. Some believed she boarded a Greyhound bus. Others suspected she accepted a ride from an acquaintance. Whatever the case, she left San Diego behind. Elizabeth arrived in Los Angeles the next day. Several witnesses reported seeing her at the Biltmore Hotel, one of the city's most glamorous landmarks. The hotel's lobby, decorated with high ceilings, chandeliers, and ornate furnishings, was alive with the movement of businessmen, travelers, and hopeful starlets. It was the kind of place where Elizabeth, despite her hardships, seemed to belong, elegant, poised, with the quiet confidence of someone who refused to give up her dreams. At the Biltmore, Elizabeth asked staff about phone calls. Some witnesses remembered her pacing in the lobby, glancing often at the grand doors, as if she were waiting for someone to arrive. Others recalled her seated quietly, scanning the crowd. Was she meeting a friend, a lover, or someone entirely new? By evening, she had vanished into the streets beyond the Biltmore. This would be the final confirmed sighting of Elizabeth Short alive. For the next 6 days, the record of Elizabeth's life falls silent. This blank stretch of time has haunted investigators for decades. Where did she go? Who was she with? And why did no one come forward to fill in the missing details? Over the years, countless witnesses offered conflicting accounts. Some swore they saw her walking through downtown Los Angeles, head held high despite the cold January air. Others claimed she was spotted in cafes or taverns, sitting across from a man whose face they could never quite recall. A few insisted she had been seen traveling west, toward Hollywood, where dreams and desperation collided on every corner. But none of these reports were ever confirmed. What is certain is that Elizabeth was moving through a city marked by contrasts. Post-war Los Angeles was a place of light and shadow. By day, palm trees swayed in the breeze, and the film studios hummed with activity. By night, neon signs lit up the avenues, masking alleys filled with crime, corruption, and danger. For a woman with no permanent home, no money, and only acquaintances to rely on, the city could be both alluring and deadly. Investigators believed Elizabeth may have stayed with someone during this time. Perhaps a friend, perhaps a stranger. But no one ever stepped forward to admit hosting her. Was it fear, guilt, or the possibility that the person who sheltered her was the very one responsible for what would follow? The days between January 9th and January 15th remain the most haunting chapter of this case. They represent the unknowable, a stretch of time where anything could have happened. Did Elizabeth trust someone who offered her safety, only to discover too late that she was trapped? Was she being followed, watched by someone who knew her movements better than she knew herself? Or was she already under the control of her killer, hidden away until the moment they chose to reveal her fate? These questions linger, heavy and unrelenting, because every answer leads only to more uncertainty. And in those days of silence, Elizabeth Short was slowly vanishing, not yet from the world, but from the memory of those who might have saved her. At dawn on January 15th, 1947, the silence was broken. In a vacant lot in a quiet neighborhood of Los Angeles, Elizabeth Short's body was discovered. The brutality of the scene would soon shock the entire nation. But what makes it more chilling is the absence of answers about her final days. How she spent those hours, who she was with, and why no one came forward to explain how a vibrant young woman could disappear into darkness so completely. The discovery of Elizabeth Short's body would mark the beginning of one of the largest investigations in Los Angeles history. Detectives, reporters, and citizens alike would become obsessed with uncovering the truth. But the deeper they searched, the stranger the story became. This was not just a murder. It was the creation of a legend that would forever be known as the Black Dahlia. It was the morning of January 15th, 1947. Los Angeles was just beginning to stir. The air was cool, the sky pale with winter light, and the streets were quiet. In a modest neighborhood south of downtown, a young mother named Betty Berzinger pushed her stroller along Norton Avenue. Her little daughter sat inside, restless but calm, as they made their way toward errands. The area was still largely undeveloped, rows of empty lots, weeds pushing up through dry soil, and only a few scattered homes nearby. As she walked, Betty's eyes drifted to the vacant lot across the street. At first, she thought she saw something discarded in the grass. Maybe a mannequin, broken and left behind from one of the shops on Crenshaw. But as she drew closer, her steps slowed. The shape was too still, too deliberate, and as the morning light caught it, Betty realized with sudden horror, this was no mannequin. Laid out before her was the body of a young woman, pale, motionless, and divided cleanly in two. The upper half lay several inches from the lower, separated at the waist with surgical precision. Her arms were placed carefully at her sides, her legs extended neatly, almost as if she had been arranged for display. She had been drained entirely of blood, her skin ghostly white against the earth. There were no signs of clothing, no attempt at concealment. She had been left there deliberately, as if meant to be found. Betty froze in shock. Clutching her child close, she turned and ran, heart pounding, until she reached the nearest house. Breathless, she pounded on the door and begged them to call the police. Within minutes, the lot on Norton Avenue would become the site of one of the most infamous crime scenes in American history. When officers arrived, they were struck by the sheer brutality of what lay before them. Even the most experienced detectives had rarely seen anything like it. The body was cut with unnerving precision, a method known as a hemicorporectomy, which required surgical skill to execute without damaging bone. Whoever had done this knew anatomy and had taken time, but it was not only the cuts that horrified them. Her face bore deep lacerations, carved from the corners of her mouth toward her ears, leaving a permanent, haunting smile. Reporters would later dub it the Glasgow smile. To investigators, it was both grotesque and deliberate, a signature, perhaps, of the killer's intention to shock. Detectives quickly cordoned off the scene, but the neighborhood was already stirring with curiosity. Crowds began to gather, drawn by whispers of what had been found. Within hours, the media descended, their cameras flashing, their questions cutting through the air. This was 1947. Los Angeles was a city enthralled by scandal, and the murder of a young woman in such a manner would ignite a frenzy unlike anything the city had seen before. Word spread quickly. Parents in the neighborhood pulled their children inside. Residents locked their doors, speaking in hushed tones about what kind of person could commit such an act. For a city already uneasy with rising crime and corruption, the brutality of this discovery seemed almost unimaginable. The idea that someone capable of such violence was walking freely among them was enough to stir both fear and fascination. Reporters swarmed the crime scene, often arriving before evidence could be secured. Details, some true, some exaggerated, made headlines by the next morning. The public was horrified, but also captivated. Who was the victim? And what could have driven someone to kill in such a calculated way? It would not take long to identify her. Through fingerprints, police confirmed the victim was Elizabeth Short, a 22-year-old aspiring actress from Massachusetts. But to the public, her name would soon be overshadowed by the title that the press gave her, the Black Dahlia. The nickname came from her rumored fondness for sheer black clothing, and perhaps also from a noir film playing in theaters at the time, the Blue Dahlia. The press fused fact with imagination, and soon Elizabeth Short's real life was lost beneath a myth. What followed was a storm. Newspapers battled for the most lurid details. Reporters tracked down anyone who had known Elizabeth, piecing together fragments of her life, but often twisting them into scandal. They painted her as mysterious, dangerous, even promiscuous, feeding into the pulp narrative that audiences devoured. In truth, Elizabeth had been a young woman struggling to find stability, dreaming of stardom, and caught in circumstances beyond her control. But the media's portrayal made her larger than life, a character in a grim Hollywood tale. Meanwhile, the police were under immense pressure. The brutality of the crime demanded answers, and the public demanded justice. Dozens of detectives were assigned to the case, but with every lead came new dead ends. Elizabeth's last days had been filled with uncertainty, and now, her death was cloaked in mystery. Why do you think the killers staged her body this way? Was it to shock the public, to taunt investigators, or perhaps to send a message only they understood? The discovery of Elizabeth Short's body marked only the beginning. In the days and weeks that followed, investigators would be overwhelmed by false confessions, unreliable witnesses, and a growing number of suspects. The Black Dahlia case would spiral into one of the most infamous unsolved murders in American history, and every step deeper into the investigation revealed only more questions, never answers. By the afternoon of January 15th, 1947, the crime scene on Norton Avenue had been photographed, combed for evidence, and swarmed by reporters. But for the Los Angeles Police Department, the nightmare was only beginning. What had been discovered was more than a murder. It was a puzzle of precision, cruelty, and spectacle, and the city wanted answers. The LAPD immediately launched a massive investigation. Hundreds of officers were pulled in, and the city was blanketed with inquiries. They scoured hotels, rooming houses, bars, and nightclubs. Every doctor, surgeon, and medical student in Los Angeles was questioned. Within weeks, over 150 suspects had been interviewed. Each one seemed promising at first. Each one led nowhere. And yet, the leads kept coming. Tips flooded the station. Rumors poured in from all corners of the city. Some claimed they had seen Elizabeth with shadowy men in dark suits. Others swore they had overheard whispers in smoky bars about a girl who knew too much. The truth was buried in the noise. Then came the letters. In the days following the murder, the Los Angeles Examiner newspaper received an envelope addressed to its editor. Inside was Elizabeth Short's personal belongings, her birth certificate, social security card, photographs, and an address book. They had been carefully cleaned with gasoline, erasing all fingerprints. A chilling note was included, constructed from magazine clippings, reading, "Here is Dahlia's belongings. Letter to follow." More notes would arrive over the weeks, taunting the police and the press. Some claimed responsibility for the murder. Others mocked investigators for their failures. Each one was studied, fingerprinted, analyzed, but none brought them closer to the killer. And while some letters were dismissed as hoaxes, at least one seemed genuine. It suggested the murderer wanted the attention and wanted control of the story. Soon, the case drew in not only letters but people. Dozens of men and women came forward to confess to the murder of Elizabeth Short. Some arrived at police headquarters voluntarily, demanding to be arrested. Others sent written confessions by mail. Over time, the number of confessions would swell to more than 60. Investigators quickly realized that the majority were false, opportunists, attention seekers, or disturbed individuals looking for notoriety. But each one had to be examined, and each one wasted precious time. Behind the scenes, detectives began focusing on a series of men whose names would haunt the case for decades. One of them was a local doctor, a man with knowledge of anatomy, a reputation for arrogance, and whispers of darker tendencies. Dr. George Hodel, a wealthy physician living in a Spanish-style mansion in Hollywood. Brilliant but secretive, his son, decades later, would accuse him of being the Black Dahlia killer, citing evidence hidden in family archives and even photographs resembling Elizabeth Short. In Hodel's home, parties were said to attract Hollywood elites, artists, and figures of influence. And rumors suggested that his connections ran deep, perhaps too deep for police to touch him. Other suspects emerged too. A nightclub owner with mob ties, a string of abusive boyfriends, and fleeting companions Elizabeth had encountered in her search for stability. A man who claimed to have been with her the night she disappeared. Each suspect brought a flurry of hope, followed by disappointment. Nothing ever stuck, but as the investigation wore on, troubling questions began to surface. The LAPD, in 1947, was already under fire for corruption. Officers were accused of accepting bribes, protecting criminals, and bending to the will of the city's most powerful men. Could it be that someone connected to Elizabeth's death was shielded by influence? Some theorized that the case was never truly meant to be solved, that too many reputations, in Hollywood, in politics, perhaps even in medicine, were at risk if the killer's identity came to light. Files went missing. Evidence was mishandled. Reporters often learned details before detectives did. And while the LAPD publicly promised relentless pursuit of justice behind closed doors, the case grew colder by the day. The press, meanwhile, kept the fire alive. Headlines screamed across every newspaper. Black Dahlia killer taunts police. Dahlia slayer still at large. The story became less about Elizabeth Short and more about the legend of the Black Dahlia. She was no longer seen as a young woman with hopes and dreams. She had been transformed into a symbol of horror, of glamour, of danger lurking beneath Los Angeles's glittering surface. The more the press sensationalized, the harder it became for police to sift fact from fiction. Witnesses contradicted each other. Suspects faded into rumor. And somewhere, perhaps reading the papers with satisfaction, was the person who knew the truth. Do you believe the police truly wanted this case solved, or were powerful figures protecting someone in the shadows? By the spring of 1947, the frenzy had not died down. If anything, it had intensified. More suspects, more letters, more pressure. But with every passing week, the trail grew colder. And soon, the case of Elizabeth Short would slip into a chilling category. Not just a brutal murder, but an unsolved one. And as the years stretched into decades, the theories only multiplied. By early 1947, Elizabeth Short's murder was already transforming into something bigger than the crime itself. Newspapers had given her a name that would outlive her own, the Black Dahlia. And with every headline, every photograph splashed across the front page, her story grew further from fact and closer to legend. The investigation had stalled. More than 150 suspects questioned, more than 50 confessions signed, yet none held up under scrutiny. The police had no weapon, no reliable witness, no solid lead. What they had instead were theories. And those theories would become the foundation of one of the most enduring mysteries in American history. The first theory circles back, again and again, to one man, Dr. George Hodel. Wealthy, brilliant, eccentric, and deeply disturbing. His Spanish colonial mansion on Franklin Avenue towered above Los Angeles, a labyrinth of secret rooms and shadowed halls where parties stretched into the early hours and whispers clung to the walls long after the music stopped. Guests included artists, musicians, actors, and sometimes, it was rumored, people who had no names at all. Hodel was not an ordinary doctor. He was a specialist, trained in surgery, with a mind capable of precision, a hand capable of cruelty. The cuts on Elizabeth Short's body, the careful severing at the waist, the blood drained completely, the washings to remove evidence. These were not the work of chance. They were the work of someone who understood anatomy, someone who had done it before, someone like Hodel. Years later, his own son, Steve Hodel, a veteran LAPD detective, would uncover a trove of damning clues. Hidden photographs in a family album, strikingly similar to Elizabeth Short. Transcripts of secret recordings captured by investigators, in which George Hodel's voice can be heard. Sapazina did kill the Black Dahlia. They can't prove it now. Chilling words, preserved in tape. Was it a confession? A drunken boast? Or something darker, meant for no one's ears but his own? The evidence never led to charges. George Hodel left Los Angeles in the 1950s, living abroad for years. He died in 1999, never tried, never confronted. His house, the Soden House, still stands. Tourists walk its halls now, admiring the architecture. Few know what stories those walls might keep. But the Black Dahlia's trail does not end with George Hodel. For some, the answer lies not in one man, but in many. In the underworld of organized crime that thrived in Los Angeles in the late 1940s. Post-war California was booming. Movie stars, glittering nightclubs, a nightlife that promised everything. But behind it all, the mob was pulling strings. Gambling dens, speakeasies, prostitution rings, all hidden behind the glamour of Hollywood Boulevard. Elizabeth Short often found herself on the fringes of this world. She was seen in bars with shady reputations, with men whose names never made the papers. Some believe she may have overheard something she wasn't meant to. Others suspect she had gotten too close to someone with dangerous ties. Her murder, brutal and public, could have been a warning, not just to her, but to anyone who might cross the wrong people. A body cut in half, a smile carved into her face. Theatrics as much as violence. A message delivered in the language of fear. But if the mob was responsible, why no follow-up killings? Why risk the public outrage? Why stage it so grotesquely? Questions without answers, echoes without voices. The mob theory remains plausible, but never proven. A shadow over the case that fades as quickly as it appears. Perhaps, then, the answer was not crime bosses or surgeons. Perhaps it was Hollywood itself. Los Angeles in the 1940s was a city built on dreams and shattered by them. Thousands of young women came west each year, searching for their chance. They filled casting offices, nightclubs, and hotel lobbies. Many, like Elizabeth Short, were broke, vulnerable, clinging to hope. For every starlet who rose to fame, 100 more fell into obscurity, and some fell into danger. Elizabeth Short wanted to be an actress. She wore black, carried herself with mystery, charmed everyone she met. But the Hollywood she entered was filled with predators. Men who promised stardom in exchange for silence. Men who saw ambition as weakness. Men who could end a life as easily as they ended a career. Some believe Elizabeth may have crossed paths with one of these figures. A producer, a casting agent, perhaps even an actor. Someone powerful enough to bury their connection to her. Someone ruthless enough to destroy her when she became inconvenient. This theory, too, carries weight. But like so many others, it offers no proof. Only whispers, lost in the roar of an industry that protected its own at any cost. And then there's the final possibility. The simplest, the most terrifying. That Elizabeth Short was not killed by a doctor, or a gangster, or a Hollywood insider. That she was killed by a stranger. A man who saw her walking. A man who offered her a ride, or a meal, or a drink. A man who brought her into his world and ended hers. No connections, no cover-ups, just random, unrelenting cruelty. This theory haunts investigators because it requires no conspiracy, no larger story. It suggests the case remains unsolved for one reason only, because the killer was ordinary. A man who walked among the city unnoticed, and when the deed was done, simply disappeared. How do you solve a crime with no thread to follow? How do you find a ghost in a city of millions? Theories piled up. Doctors, mobsters, actors, strangers. Each theory peeled back a layer of Los Angeles itself. The corruption, the glamour, the violence hiding beneath the neon lights. And yet none brought the truth. The case grew colder. The headlines grew bolder. And Elizabeth Short, once a daughter, a friend, a dreamer, was no longer seen as herself. She had become something else. A story, a myth, an icon of America's darkest side. And so, the Black Dahlia murder remained unsolved, but did not remain still, because with every year that passed, the case seemed to grow larger. It was no longer just about finding a killer. It was about what the crime revealed about Los Angeles itself, about America itself, about us. Of all these theories, which one do you believe? Was Elizabeth Short the victim of power, of corruption, or of chance? January 15th, 1947. The city of Los Angeles woke to an unthinkable discovery. A young woman's body, mutilated, drained of blood, cut into two pieces. She was posed carefully, as though her killer wanted her found, wanted her death to speak louder than her life. That woman was Elizabeth Short. She was only 22 years old. Elizabeth had come to California with a dream, like so many others after the war. She wanted to be seen, to step out from the shadows of small-town life and find her place on the silver screen. She wore her hair in soft curls, her dresses neatly pressed, her lipstick perfect. She had charm, but more importantly, she had hope. Yet now, all of that hope was silenced. The life she imagined, the letters she wrote to her family, the days she walked Hollywood Boulevard searching for opportunity, all of it would be forever overshadowed by the violence of her end. The brutality of her murder was almost theatrical. Her body was washed clean of blood, as if scrubbed for display. The surgical precision with which she was cut in half spoke of someone with knowledge, or at least practice. Her face, carved into a grotesque expression, a smile that did not belong to her. Even in death, she was made into something she was not. Detectives, hardened men who had seen war and crime, stood in silence at the scene. One officer later admitted he had never seen anything like it. Reporters rushed to the field. Flashbulbs lit the morning haze. Within hours, Elizabeth Short's death was everywhere. On the radio, on the front pages, whispered about on street corners. And with it came a name, one that would outlive her own, the Black Dahlia. A moniker borrowed from a recent film noir, The Blue Dahlia. It was catchy, sensational. And in that single phrase, Elizabeth's humanity was buried beneath myth. Fiendish slayer stalks L.A. The Black Dahlia found in vacant lot. Horrific mutilation stuns city. The public was horrified. Parents kept children inside. Women feared walking alone. For a moment, Los Angeles was not a city of dreams, but a city of dread. And somewhere, the person who had done this, the one who had turned Elizabeth into a symbol of horror, walked free. 78 years have passed. Hundreds of theories, thousands of pages of reports, dozens of suspects, and yet no answer. The Black Dahlia remains unsolved. Every lead has unraveled. Every confession has proven false. Elizabeth Short's name is frozen in time, not for her life, but for the brutality of her death. The shadows of this case stretch wide. Some see the hand of a doctor with surgical skill. Others whisper of mobsters sending a message, or Hollywood predators who silenced a woman who knew too much. There are even those who believe the killer staged her body as a kind of message, a statement to the city itself. But the truth has never been found, and maybe it never will be. Elizabeth's life was brief, but she was not a ghost. She laughed with friends. She wrote letters filled with dreams. She posed for photographs with a smile that belonged to her. Yet when we remember her now, it is not her voice we hear, not her laughter, not her hope. Instead, we remember the horror, the crime scene, the headlines, the name given to her after death. That is the shadow, a shadow that stretches across generations, darkening her story, dimming her humanity. Elizabeth Short, 22 years old, a daughter, a sister, a friend. and a dreamer who believed she could find a place in the lights of Hollywood. Her story should have been one of beginnings. Instead, it became one of endings. The brutality of her murder remains unmatched. The mystery remains unsolved, and the shadow of the Black Dahlia lingers still. Over Los Angeles, over true crime history, and over the memory of a young woman whose life deserved so much more. Elizabeth never forgotten. 78 years have passed since the vacant lot on Norton Avenue became the stage for one of the most haunting crimes in American history. And yet, the Black Dahlia remains unsolved, a puzzle with too many pieces missing, a riddle that has resisted every attempt to solve it. The name Elizabeth Short has become inseparable from the title the press gave her. The Black Dahlia, a name that turned a young woman into an icon of tragedy, a myth that has grown larger with every decade. From newspaper headlines to whispered stories, from crime novels to Hollywood films, her death has been told and retold. Sometimes as fact, sometimes as fiction, but always with a shadow of fascination. Her story has seeped into the fabric of American culture. The case gave birth to countless books, documentaries, films, and even artwork, each one trying to understand the brutality, each one adding to the legend. For Hollywood, it became a mirror, a reminder that beneath the glamour of flashing lights and endless promises, there were dangers lurking in the city's shadows. For the world of true crime, it became a cornerstone, one of the earliest and most infamous unsolved cases to capture the public imagination. But behind the myth, behind the legend that headlines and history books created, there was a young woman, Elizabeth Short. She had a childhood filled with hardship, dreams of escape, and a hope for something better. She wanted to act. She wanted to be remembered for her beauty, her talent, her charm. She deserved to be remembered for her life. Instead, she is remembered for her death. Her murder became larger than she was. But the truth is simple. Elizabeth Short was more than the Black Dahlia. She was someone's daughter, someone's sister, someone's friend. She walked the streets of Los Angeles with hope in her heart, not knowing that her story would end in darkness. As the decades pass, the question remains: will the Black Dahlia murder ever be solved? Or will it remain forever locked in history as one of America's darkest mysteries? Some believe the answers are still out there, hidden in forgotten files or sealed within secrets never told. Others believe it is a story destined to remain unsolved, lost to time, a shadow with no end. In the end, the legacy of the Black Dahlia is not only a crime. It is a reminder of fragility, of how a dream can be erased in an instant, and how a life can be overshadowed by the cruelty of another. Behind the headlines, behind the legend, was Elizabeth Short, a young woman with hopes and dreams. And she deserved so much more than to be remembered only as the Black Dahlia. Elizabeth Short, 1924 to 1947. A life cut short, a mystery that endures. For nearly an hour, we have walked the same path investigators did back in 1947, piecing together fragments of Elizabeth Short's life, retracing the last days of a young woman who dreamed of Hollywood lights, and confronting the nightmare that followed. Her story became legend, her death a shadow that has never lifted. But Elizabeth's case is not an isolated tragedy. Los Angeles has always been a city of contradictions, glamour and darkness, fame and failure, dreams and disappearances. For every rising star on the silver screen, there are countless forgotten names, countless stories of those who vanished without a trace, or who were found in ways too haunting to forget. Just a few years after Elizabeth's murder, Los Angeles would once again find itself at the center of another chilling mystery. Another case with whispers of influence, whispers of power, and whispers of Hollywood's darker underbelly. Some said it was connected. Others believed it was only coincidence. But like the Dahlia, this case would remain unsolved, leaving behind more questions than answers. And now we leave the question with you. After everything you've seen, after every theory you've heard, who do you believe killed Elizabeth Short? A man of wealth and power, protected by influence? A predator hiding in plain sight? or a figure already lost to time, their name buried with them? Share your theory in the comments below, because sometimes the truth doesn't hide in shadows. Sometimes it's right in front of us, waiting to be seen.